The carriage wheels stopped outside the gate before dawn, and Alina Ashworth already knew her life was about to end the way she had known it. Her mother stood in the hallway with a letter clutched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Alina had not been told what the letter said, but she did not need to be told. She had watched her mother's face change from worry to shame to something colder, something final, over the course of a single evening. Now, at 5 in the morning, with the household staff pretending to sleep and her father refusing to look at her, Alina understood that whatever was about to happen had already been decided without her. "You will go to your Aunt Margaret," her mother said, not meeting her eyes. "It is arranged. The carriage leaves within the hour." Alina did not ask why. She already knew why. She had known why for 3 years, ever since she corrected a magistrate's arithmetic at her own family's dinner table, in front of 40 guests, without thinking twice about the consequences. She had known why every time she opened a book meant for her brothers. Every time she solved a problem before the tutors could finish explaining it. Every time she spoke a truth that was better left unsaid in a room full of people who preferred comfortable lies. She was too clever, and in her world, that was not a gift. It was a wound that needed to be hidden, and when it could not be hidden, it needed to be removed. "Does father know I am leaving before I do?" Alina asked quietly. Her mother's silence was answer enough. Alina climbed the stairs to her room without another word, packed the few things that mattered to her, and did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears, not even in private, not even when no one was watching. Crying felt like agreeing with them, and she refused to agree that there was anything wrong with her mind. When she came back down, her father was standing by the door. He looked older than she remembered, as though the argument he must have lost the night before had aged him by years in a single evening. "I tried," he said simply. "I know," Alina answered, and she meant it. She had heard him arguing through the walls the previous night, his voice rising and falling against her mother's cold insistence, and the sharper, crueler tones of her uncle, who had driven from the neighboring estate specifically to settle the matter of what should be done about her. "She frightens the Pemberton boy," her uncle had said. "She frightens every eligible man in the county. Do you want your other daughters to inherit her reputation along with her nonsense?" Alina had not been meant to hear that, but the walls of the house were thin, and she had learned long ago that eavesdropping was often the only way to learn the truth about her own life. Her father placed a small leather case in her hands now, saying nothing about what was inside it. She would not open it until the carriage had traveled several miles, and when she did, she would find a modest sum of money, a few books he must have smuggled from his own study, and a single note in his handwriting that said only, "Do not let them make you smaller than you are." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, and it would have to last her a very long time. The carriage ride to the coast took 2 full days. Alina spent most of it staring out the window at fields she did not recognize, calculating distances out of habit, counting mile markers, estimating the carriage's speed against the position of the sun simply because her mind refused to sit still even when her heart was breaking. It was a strange comfort, the numbers. They did not judge her. They did not whisper behind fans at parties or exchange knowing looks when she spoke too plainly. Numbers simply were what they were, honest in a way that people rarely managed to be. By the time the carriage reached the narrow coastal road that led to her aunt's cottage, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and gray and heavy with the promise of rain. The cottage itself sat at the edge of a cliff, weathered and small, with ivy creeping up one side and a garden that had clearly been left to fend for itself for longer than anyone would admit. Margaret Hollis met her at the door with a lantern in one hand and an expression that was difficult to read. She was Alina's mother's older sister, a widow who had lived alone on this stretch of coast for nearly a decade, and the family rarely spoke of her except in hushed, uncomfortable tones. Alina had met her only twice before, both times at funerals, and had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with her in her entire life. "So they finally sent you," Margaret said, stepping aside to let her in. There was no cruelty in her voice, but there was no particular warmth either. I wondered how long it would take them. You knew? Eleanor asked, startled. I have been expecting a clever niece to arrive at my door for years, Margaret said, closing the door against the wind. Your family has never known what to do with anyone who refuses to be simple. I was the same, once, before they decided the coast was far enough away for my kind of trouble. Eleanor stood in the small entryway, dripping rainwater onto the stone floor, and felt something shift in her chest. She was not the first. There was a pattern here, a family history of exile disguised as visits and arrangements and finishing educations, and she had simply never been told about it because no one imagined she would need to know. Sit, Margaret said, gesturing toward a chair by the fire. You must be exhausted, and there is a great deal to explain, but it can wait until morning. Tonight you will eat, and you will sleep, and tomorrow you will begin to understand what your life is going to look like now. Eleanor did as she was told, mostly because she did not have the strength to argue, and because for the first time in 3 days, someone was looking at her without judgment in their eyes. That night, lying in a narrow bed under a roof that creaked with every gust of wind off the sea, Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had been cast out, not for cruelty, not for dishonesty, not for any true wrongdoing, but for the simple crime of thinking too quickly and speaking too honestly in a world built for people who preferred not to think at all. Her sisters would marry well now, unburdened by her presence. Her mother would breathe easier at dinner parties. Her father would go on losing arguments he was too tired to keep fighting. And she would be here, at the edge of the world, with a stranger who happened to share her blood and perhaps her curse. She did not sleep well that first night. She lay awake listening to the waves crash against the cliffs below the cottage, a sound so different from anything she had known in her sheltered childhood home, and she found herself, despite everything, doing what she always did when the world became too much to bear. She began to think. She began to plan. If this was to be her life now, she would not simply endure it. She would understand it, master it, and eventually, she promised herself in the darkness, she would find a way to matter again on her own terms, whether anyone approved of her or not. The following morning, Margaret woke her before the sun had fully risen and handed her a cup of something bitter and warm that she called tea, though it bore little resemblance to the delicate blends Eleanor had grown up drinking. There is no staff here, Margaret said, watching Eleanor's reaction to the drink with something like amusement. Not the way you are used to. I have a girl who comes twice a week to help with the heaviest work, and a boy who tends the small bit of land I still farm, but for the most part, this house runs on whatever effort I put into it myself. I expect the same from you. Eleanor set down the cup and nodded slowly. She had never been asked to work with her hands before, not truly, not beyond the decorative embroidery and painting that passed for accomplishment in her old life. But she found, oddly, that the idea did not frighten her. If anything, it felt like relief. There would be no dinner parties here to navigate, no careful performances of ignorance to protect fragile egos, no watching her words for fear of frightening away a suitor who could not tolerate a wife who read faster than he did. I am not afraid of work, Eleanor said. Margaret studied her for a long moment, and something like approval flickered across her weathered face. No, she said, I did not think you would be. Come. Let me show you what needs to be done, and let me tell you about the people you will meet, because they will not be like the people you knew before. Some of them will test you. Most of them do not care what a woman knows, only what she can prove. Eleanor spent the rest of that first full day walking the boundaries of her aunt's small property, learning the names of the tenant families who worked the surrounding land, and listening more than she spoke, which did not come naturally to her but which she forced herself to practice. She noticed, almost immediately, that the estate's affairs were in worse order than her aunt had let on. Records were incomplete. Rents had been miscalculated for at least 2 seasons running, in ways that clearly favored no one and simply reflected careless bookkeeping. A boundary dispute with a neighboring farmer had been simmering for months, unresolved, draining goodwill from both sides. By the second evening, Eleanor could not help herself. She sat at the small writing desk in the cottage's main room, pulled out the ledgers Margaret kept in a drawer more out of obligation than diligence, and began, quietly, to fix what she found broken. She did not ask permission. She simply worked, the way she always had, letting the numbers organize themselves into patterns beneath her pen, feeling for the first time in days something close to peace. By midnight, she had recalculated 3 seasons of rent, identified the exact source of the miscalculation, and drafted a fair proposal for resolving the boundary dispute that gave both farmers something they could accept without losing face. When Margaret found the papers the next morning, she said nothing for a long while. She simply read through them twice, her lips pressed into a thin line of concentration, and then she looked up at Alina with an expression that was entirely new. "Your family called this a flaw," Margaret said slowly. "They called it many things," Alina said. "Flaw was one of the kinder words." Margaret folded the papers carefully and set them aside. "They were fools," she said. "And I suspect, Alina, that this coast has been waiting a very long time for someone exactly like you, whether it knows it yet or not." Alina did not answer, but something in her chest, something that had felt bruised and small since the moment the carriage arrived at her family's gate, began, very quietly, to heal. Outside the window, the sea continued its endless rhythm against the rocks, indifferent to the small dramas of the house above it, and Alina found herself thinking, for the first time since her exile began, that perhaps this was not only an ending. Perhaps, in ways she could not yet fully see, it was also a beginning, one she would have to build herself, plank by plank, decision by decision, in a place where no one had yet decided what she was allowed to become. She did not know, that quiet evening by the fire, that less than 3 months later, a carriage bearing a crest far grander than her family's would arrive on this same coastal road, carrying a man who would ask nothing of her except the very thing everyone else had spent her whole life asking her to hide. But that was still to come, and for now, Alina Ashworth simply closed the ledger, banked the fire for the night, and allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. The following weeks settled into a rhythm Alina had never known before, one built entirely around usefulness rather than appearance. She rose early, before Margaret, and walked the cliff path to clear her head while the sky was still gray with the last of night. She learned to keep the household accounts properly, then improved upon the system her aunt had used for years, building simple ledgers that any steward in the county would have envied. She began to understand, through long conversations with the tenant farmers who called at the cottage, that the local economy ran on a fragile web of debts, favors, and old grudges that no one had ever bothered to untangle. It was Daniel Price, a fisherman with sun-weathered hands and a habit of squinting suspiciously at anyone who spoke too formally, who first tested her openly. He arrived at the cottage one afternoon demanding to speak with Margaret about a dispute over fishing rights along a stretch of shoreline that bordered both the Hollies' land and the land of a neighboring family. When Margaret gestured toward Alina instead, Daniel's expression made his opinion of the arrangement plain. "No offense meant," he said, "but this is a matter of old boundaries and older agreements. It needs someone who understands how things have always been done here, not a young lady fresh from the city with a head full of books." Alina did not argue with him. She simply asked him to explain the dispute in full, listened without interrupting, and then asked for the old agreements themselves, the actual documents, yellowed and half forgotten in a chest in the parish office. When Daniel returned 3 days later, skeptical that anything useful could come of the request, Alina had already found the answer buried in a clause from 2 generations earlier that both families had entirely forgotten existed, a clause that settled the dispute cleanly and fairly, without favoring either side. Daniel stared at the paper for a long moment, then at Alina, and something shifted behind his eyes. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose books have their uses after all." It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something Alina had rarely experienced in her old life. Respect that had nothing to do with her name, her dowry, or her willingness to remain quiet in a room full of louder voices. Word of the fishing rights dispute spread quickly along the coast, as word of most things did in a community small enough that everyone's business belonged, in some sense, to everyone else. Within weeks, Alina found herself sought out for advice on matters ranging from inheritance disagreements to the fair division of a shared well, each problem arriving at her door dressed as a favor to her aunt but landing, more often than not, squarely in her own capable hands. She did not tell anyone how much she treasured this. She had spent her whole life being told that her mind was a burden to everyone around her. And here, suddenly, that same mind was being asked for, valued, even trusted with matters that shaped the daily lives of dozens of families. She began to understand, slowly, and with a kind of quiet astonishment, that the problem had never truly been her intelligence. The problem had been the shape of the world she had been born into, a world too small and too frightened to make room for a woman who thought clearly and spoke honestly. Here, on this stretch of coast where survival mattered more than appearances, there was room enough. Still, Exile was Exile, and there were nights when the loneliness of it settled over Alina like the sea mist that crept up the cliffs each evening. She missed her father's quiet company, even if he had failed to protect her. She missed her sisters, despite the distance that had always existed between her mind and theirs. She wondered sometimes what her old friends said about her now, whether her name had become a cautionary tale whispered to other young women who read too eagerly or spoke too plainly at the wrong moment. Margaret, who seemed to sense these darker evenings without being told, took to sitting with her by the fire on such nights, sharing stories of her own exile decades earlier, of the husband she had eventually found who valued her mind rather than fearing it, and of the long, difficult, ultimately worthwhile process of building a life from nothing but her own resourcefulness. "It does get easier," Margaret told her one such evening, the wind rattling the windows outside. "Not because the world changes, mind you. The world is slow to change and slower still to admit its mistakes. It gets easier because you stop waiting for its permission." Alina turned that thought over many times in the weeks that followed, testing it against her own experience the way she tested any idea, looking for its weaknesses and its strengths. She found, to her surprise, that it held up rather well. By late autumn, nearly 3 months into her exile, Alina had become something the coastal community had never quite had before. A quiet, capable presence whose judgment people trusted more than they trusted their own instincts on matters of law, numbers, and fairness. She still missed her family in the aching, complicated way one misses people who have failed them, but she no longer felt as though her life had ended the day that carriage arrived at her gate. If anything, she had begun to suspect, in her most private thoughts, that her life might only just be beginning. She had no way of knowing, as she sat by the fire mending a torn hem with more determination than skill, that the very dispute she had settled for Daniel Price and his neighbors would soon draw the attention of a far more powerful landholder, a duke whose family had quietly owned a portion of the surrounding coastline for generations, and who had recently taken a personal interest in irregularities among his distant holdings. Nor could she have guessed that his inquiries would lead him, within a matter of weeks, directly to her aunt's small cottage on the cliff, and to the clever, exiled young woman who had unknowingly solved a problem that had troubled his family's affairs for far longer than anyone in the region realized. For now, she simply lived her days as they came, one ledger, one dispute, one small victory at a time, unaware that the life she was quietly building for herself was about to collide, without warning, with a man who would refuse, entirely and without apology, to see her cleverness as anything other than exactly what it was. A gift rare and worth claiming. The letter that changed everything arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, tucked among ordinary correspondence about wool prices and a dispute over a shared hedgerow, and Alina almost set it aside without reading it twice. It bore an unfamiliar seal, dark wax pressed with a crest she did not recognize, addressed not to Margaret but directly to Alina herself, which was strange enough to make her pause before opening it. The letter was brief and businesslike, requesting that the writer, identified only as a representative of the Calloway estate, be permitted to call upon the household within the week to discuss a matter concerning boundary records and recent settlements in the parish. It gave no further explanation, and offered no apology for the short notice, simply stating a date and time as though the recipient's agreement were assumed rather than requested. Alina read it 3 times before showing it to Margaret, who went very still when she saw the seal. "Calloway," Margaret said quietly. "That is not a name that troubles itself with small coastal disputes, Alina. Whatever you have stirred up with your ledgers and your clever solutions, it has caught the attention of people considerably more important than fishermen and farmers." "Should I be worried?" Alina asked, though something in her chest felt more like anticipation than fear. "I do not know," Margaret admitted. "But I suspect you are about to find out." The days leading up to the appointed visit passed slowly, filled with a strange, restless energy Alina did not fully understand. She reviewed her records obsessively, making certain every calculation she had made over the past months could withstand scrutiny from even the most demanding examiner. She told herself this was simple professional caution, the natural instinct of someone who had learned, through painful experience, that her work would always be judged more harshly than anyone else's. But some part of her recognized, if she was honest, that she was also curious, in a way she had not allowed herself to feel about anything new in a very long time. On the appointed day, the carriage that arrived at the cottage gate was unlike anything the narrow coastal road had seen in years, gleaming and well kept, drawn by matched horses that spoke of considerable wealth and even more considerable indifference to the muddy conditions of a fishing village in late autumn. Alina watched from the window as a tall man stepped down from the carriage, dressed plainly for someone who clearly did not need to dress plainly, and paused for a moment to survey the cottage and the cliffs beyond it with an expression she could not quite read. He did not look like a man accustomed to being kept waiting, and yet he waited patiently enough at the door when Margaret answered it, introducing himself simply as Rhys Calloway, without any of the elaborate titles Alina half expected given the crest on his letter. "I understand," he said, once he had been shown into the small sitting room and offered tea he did not touch, "that a dispute regarding fishing rights along the eastern shoreline was recently settled using a clause from an agreement drawn up nearly 60 years ago. I understand further that the settlement was, by every account I have gathered, remarkably fair to both parties involved, which is more than I can say for most disputes my own stewards manage to resolve." "That is correct," Alina said, keeping her voice even despite the way his gaze had settled directly on her rather than on Margaret, who technically owned the household he was addressing. "I am told you were responsible for finding the clause and drafting the settlement," he continued. "I am also told you have quietly resolved at least 4 other disputes in this parish over the past several months, each involving records that most people would not have thought to examine so carefully." Alina felt Margaret's eyes on her, curious now rather than protective, waiting to see how she would handle a man who spoke so directly, without any of the careful indirection that governed most conversations of this kind. "I do not see the harm in helping my neighbors when I am able," Alina said carefully. "If that has somehow become a matter of interest to the Calloway estate, I would be glad to understand why." Something in the Duke's expression shifted then, a flicker of what might have been amusement, or perhaps simply surprise at being answered so plainly by a young woman he had clearly expected to be more deferential. "The harm," he said, "is that my own stewards have spent 3 years failing to resolve a boundary matter considerably larger and more costly than the one you settled in an afternoon, using records that have apparently been sitting in a parish office this entire time, unread by anyone with the patience or the wit to make sense of them." He paused, studying her with an intensity that Alina found neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. "I did not come here today merely out of curiosity, Miss Ashworth," he said. "I came because I have a problem considerably larger than fishing rights, one that has cost my estate a great deal of money and considerably more goodwill among tenants who no longer trust my administration to treat them fairly. I am told you are the sort of person who finds such problems interesting rather than tedious." Alina felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had perfected over years of hiding her true reactions from people who found them threatening. "What sort of problem?" she asked. "The sort," the Duke said, "that requires someone willing to read 60 years of neglected records without complaint, someone who understands both law and arithmetic well enough to catch errors that trained clerks have somehow missed for generations, and someone, frankly, who is not afraid to tell me I am wrong when the evidence says so." He set down the cup he had not touched and looked at her directly. Without the practiced charm most men of his station used to soften difficult requests. "I am told that describes you rather precisely," he said. "I would like to offer you a position managing the disputed portion of my coastal holdings, with full authority to review the records, correct the errors, and settle the outstanding matters as you see fit, subject only to my final approval. The pay would be considerably more than fair, and the work, I suspect, would suit you far better than whatever quiet obscurity your family imagined for you when they sent you to this coast." The room went very still. Margaret's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Even the fire seemed to crackle more quietly, as though the whole cottage were holding its breath alongside Eleanor. "You know why I was sent here," Eleanor said slowly. "It was not quite a question." "I made inquiries," the Duke admitted, with no trace of embarrassment. "It seemed relevant, given what I intended to ask of you today." "And it does not concern you," Eleanor pressed, "that the very quality my own family found so intolerable is the quality you are now asking me to use on your behalf." For the first time since he had entered the room, something like real feeling crossed the Duke's composed features, quick and sharp, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I did not come here to apologize for the world's failure to appreciate a clever mind, because I suspect you have heard enough apologies that changed nothing to last a lifetime. I came here because I have a genuine problem and you appear to be, by every account I can find, the person best equipped in this entire county to solve it. Whether the rest of the world approves of that fact is, frankly, none of my concern." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over any important decision, examining it from every angle for weaknesses. She found, to her quiet astonishment, that she could locate none. "I will need to see the records myself before I agree to anything," she said finally. "I do not accept positions on the strength of flattery alone, Your Grace, however unusual the flattery may be." The corner of the Duke's mouth lifted, just slightly, in what might have been the beginning of real respect. "I would have been disappointed," he said, "if you had answered any other way." Outside the cottage window, the sea continued its endless rhythm against the cliffs, indifferent as ever to the quiet turning point unfolding within, and Eleanor Ashworth, exiled for being too clever, found herself facing, for the first time since the carriage had taken her from everything she once knew, an offer built entirely around the very thing she had once been told to hide. She did not yet know how far this offer would carry her, or how much it would eventually cost the man who had made it. But she knew, with the same clarity she brought to every ledger and every dispute, that she would not refuse the chance to find out. Eleanor spent the following week buried in the records the Duke's steward delivered to the cottage. 3 heavy crates of documents dating back further than she had expected, covering leases, surveys, and correspondence that had clearly been mishandled by a succession of careless administrators. She worked from early morning until the candle burned low each night, cross-referencing old maps against newer surveys, tracking the slow drift of boundary markers that had shifted, quite literally, over decades of neglect and convenient forgetting. What she found astonished even her. The dispute was not simple carelessness, as the Duke had assumed. Buried within the oldest documents was evidence that a previous steward, now long dead, had deliberately altered several boundary records to benefit a neighboring landholder in exchange for private favors. A small and quiet corruption that had gone unnoticed for nearly 30 years, because no one had ever bothered to compare the original surveys against the versions currently in use. When Eleanor presented her findings to the Duke at their second meeting, laying out the evidence methodically, document by document, She watched his expression change from polite interest to genuine astonishment, and finally to something that looked remarkably like anger, though not directed at her. 30 years, he said quietly, staring at the papers spread across the table. 30 years, and not one of my stewards thought to look this closely. Not one of your stewards had reason to suspect wrongdoing, Alina pointed out. Fraud built carefully enough does not announce itself. It simply looks like ordinary neglect unless someone is willing to compare every document against every other document, which is tedious work that most people are unwilling to do. But you were willing, the Duke said, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, equal parts curiosity and something warmer that she did not yet have a name for. I find tedious work considerably more tolerable than being told my mind is a burden, Alina said simply. It has become something of a comfort to me, in its own strange way. The Duke did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and Alina found herself unable to look away, aware suddenly of how close they were standing, of how the afternoon light through the cottage window caught the sharp lines of his face in a way that made her thoughts, ordinarily so orderly, scatter like startled birds. I owe you considerably more than fair pay for this discovery, he said finally. This corruption has cost my tenants years of unjust rents and lost land. Correcting it properly will take months of careful work, and it will not be simple, given how many people benefited from the arrangement remaining hidden. I did not take this position expecting it to be simple, Alina said. No, the Duke agreed, something like admiration coloring his voice. I do not suppose you did. Over the following months, Alina threw herself into the work with an energy she had not felt since long before her exile. She traveled the disputed portions of the coastline herself, meeting tenants who had spent years believing themselves simply unlucky, explaining patiently and carefully how their rents had been miscalculated and their boundaries quietly shifted against them. She drafted corrections, negotiated settlements, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt the trust that decades of quiet corruption had eroded. The Duke, to her surprise, involved himself directly in much of this work, riding out with her to meet tenants, listening to her explanations of complicated legal precedents with genuine attention, rather than the polite boredom she had grown used to from men of his station. He asked questions that showed he had actually considered her previous answers, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. A small thing that nonetheless struck Alina as remarkable given how rarely she had experienced it in her life before now. They argued too, more than once, over matters of judgment where their instincts differed, and Alina found, with some surprise, that the Duke did not retreat from disagreement the way most men she had known retreated, either into wounded silence or dismissive condescension. He argued his position, listened to hers, and more often than not, when the evidence favored her reasoning, he said so plainly, without the bruised ego she had learned to expect from men accustomed to being agreed with. It was during one such argument, late on a cold evening as they reviewed a particularly complicated tenancy dispute by lamplight in the Duke's study, that Alina first allowed herself to consider what was happening between them, not simply as employer and steward, but as two people who had somehow become, against every expectation she had carried with her since childhood, genuine equals in conversation. You disagree with nearly everything I propose, the Duke observed, not unkindly, as she pointed out a flaw in his reasoning for the third time that evening. I disagree when you are wrong, Alina corrected, which, to your credit, is considerably less often than most men in your position. The Duke laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded in a way she had not yet heard from him, and something in Alina's chest tightened pleasantly at the sound of it. My father would have dismissed a steward for speaking to me the way you do, he said. Your father, Alina said carefully, employed the steward who spent 30 years overlooking fraud that cost his tenants a fortune. Perhaps a little more disagreement would have served him well. The Duke's expression sobered, but the warmth in his eyes did not fade. You are entirely correct, he said, as I have noticed you nearly always are. It was not flattery, Alina realized watching him. It was simply honesty, the same currency she herself dealt in, and she found, with something between wonder and quiet fear, that she trusted it entirely. She did not know, that cold evening in his study, how soon this quiet, growing understanding between them would be tested by forces considerably larger and more dangerous than boundary disputes. Forces that included her own family, suddenly eager to reclaim a daughter they had once discarded, and a society that would not so easily forgive a duke for choosing a woman it had already judged and found wanting. But for now, in the warm lamplight, surrounded by papers that told the story of a wrong they were slowly making right, Alina allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply be happy. Word of Alina's work reached the wider county long before she expected it to, carried along the coast by grateful tenants and curious gossip in equal measure. It did not take many weeks before the story took on a shape considerably grander than the truth, transformed by repetition into a tale of a mysterious clever woman who had uncovered decades of hidden corruption, and won the personal respect of a duke known throughout the region for his cold reserve and exacting standards. Eventually, inevitably, the story traveled far enough to reach Alina's own family. The letter arrived from her mother, the first correspondence Alina had received from her since the morning the carriage took her away, and its warmth was so sudden and so unfamiliar that Alina read it twice before she trusted herself to understand it correctly. Her mother wrote of missing her, of regretting the harshness of their parting, of hoping that Alina might soon consider a visit home now that circumstances had, as she put it, changed so favorably. Alina understood immediately what had truly changed. It was not her family's opinion of her mind. It was the sudden, undeniable proof that her mind had attracted the attention and apparent regard of one of the most eligible and powerful men in the region. The same cleverness that had made her unmarriageable in her mother's eyes 8 months earlier had, through no change of her own, become suddenly, remarkably desirable now that it carried the possibility of a duke's favor attached to it. She showed the letter to Margaret, who read it with an expression of weary recognition. "They will come themselves before long," Margaret warned. "Letters are simply the opening move. Your mother will not be satisfied until she has seen the situation with her own eyes and calculated precisely how much of it she can claim credit for." Margaret's prediction proved accurate within a fortnight. Alina's parents arrived at the cottage unannounced, her mother dressed in her finest traveling clothes as though attending an important social event, rather than visiting the daughter she had exiled, her father trailing behind with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated relief that at least softened Alina's guarded reception of them both. The visit was, in nearly every respect, exactly as uncomfortable as Alina had expected. Her mother spoke of the county's gossip with poorly disguised delight, asked pointed questions about the nature of Alina's relationship with the Duke, and made several remarks about how proud the family was of her accomplishments that rang so hollow against the memory of her exile that Alina had to work hard to keep her expression civil. It was her father's quieter conversation, taken alone during a walk along the cliff path while her mother rested indoors, that affected Alina more deeply. He apologized, plainly and without excuse, for failing to protect her, for allowing her mother and uncle to convince him that exile was the only solution to a problem that had never truly needed solving. He told her haltingly that he had thought of her every day since she left, and that whatever happened now with the Duke, he hoped she would choose it because it made her happy, and not because it offered a convenient path back into a family that had failed her so completely. Alina found herself, to her own surprise, forgiving him at least partially, in a way she could not quite bring herself to forgive her mother. It was not that her father's failure mattered less. It was that his failure had come from weakness rather than calculation, and Alina had learned enough, in her months of exile, to recognize the difference. The true test of the Duke's sincerity, however, came not from Alina's family, but from his own circle, a matter that surfaced with sudden and uncomfortable clarity when Lord Edmund Vane, a long-time associate of the Calloway family, arrived at the estate for what was supposedly a routine visit, but quickly revealed itself to be something considerably more pointed. Alina was present, at the Duke's specific request, when Lord Vane raised the subject over dinner, his tone carefully light but his meaning unmistakable. "The whole county is talking, Calloway," he said, swirling wine in his glass with studied casualness. "A duke, so thoroughly occupied with his steward's daughter that he barely attends his own social obligations anymore. One does wonder what your father would have made of it." "My father," the Duke said evenly, "would have made considerably less of the coastal fraud his own stewards allowed to continue for 30 years than Miss Ashworth managed to make of it in 3 months. I suspect his opinion on the matter would have mattered rather less to me than her competence has." "Competence?" Lord Vane repeated, glancing pointedly at Alina as though she were not present to hear herself discussed. "Is that truly what the county is calling it now?" Alina felt her spine stiffen, old instincts rising, the familiar urge to shrink herself smaller, to apologize for existing so visibly in a room full of people who found her presence inconvenient. She fought the instinct down, deliberately, the way she had learned to fight it down these past months, and met Lord Vane's gaze directly instead. "You are welcome to call it whatever you like, Lord Vane," she said calmly. "I would simply ask that you review the corrected tenancy records before forming your final opinion. I believe you will find the numbers considerably more persuasive than gossip." A brief, startled silence fell over the table. Lord Vane's expression flickered, uncertain how to respond to a directness he had clearly not expected, and the Duke, Alina noticed, was watching her with an expression of open, undisguised pride that he made no effort whatsoever to hide. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, turning back to his old associate with a tone that left no room for further argument, "has saved this estate more money and more goodwill in a few months than the rest of my administration managed in a decade. I would ask that you extend her the same respect you would extend any steward who had accomplished as much, regardless of what the county chooses to gossip about in the meantime." Lord Vane did not press the matter further that evening, though Alina understood, from the careful coldness in his farewell the following morning, that the conversation had not truly ended, merely paused. Word would travel, as it always did in circles like his, and the Duke's willingness to defend her so openly would cost him something among his peers, a cost Alina understood he had accepted knowingly, without hesitation, and without once asking her to make herself smaller to soften the blow. That night, after Lord Vane's carriage had disappeared down the coastal road, the Duke found Alina on the cliff path where she often walked to clear her thoughts, the wind sharp and cold off the darkening sea. "I owe you an apology," he said, coming to stand beside her, "for allowing you to be spoken to that way at my own table." Alina turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "You did not allow anything," she said. "You corrected him the moment he overstepped." "Perhaps," the Duke said, "but I invited him to dinner knowing his opinions, and I should have considered more carefully what that might cost you before I did." Alina studied him in the fading light, searching, as she always did, for the gap between his words and his true meaning, and finding, as she increasingly did with him, none at all. "I have spent my entire life being told my mind was a cost too high for anyone to bear," she said quietly. "I find I would rather stand beside someone willing to pay it openly than hide behind someone determined never to be tested." The Duke was silent for a long moment, the sea wind pulling at his coat, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and entirely without its usual composed reserve. "Then perhaps," he said, "it is time I asked you properly, rather than simply offering you employment and calling it enough." Alina's heart quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "Asked me what precisely?" "To stay," the Duke said, "not as my steward. As my wife, if you will have me, with full knowledge of everything that will cost you and everything it will cost me in turn, and with no apology from either of us for choosing a life the rest of the world did not think to imagine for people like us." The waves crashed against the cliffs below, steady and ancient, indifferent as always to the small, enormous moment unfolding above them, and Alina Ashworth, once exiled for the crime of being too clever, found herself facing a question she had never once expected her cleverness to earn her. She did not answer immediately. She had learned, through hard experience, never to answer anything important without first being certain of her own mind. But as she looked at the man standing beside her, waiting with a patience that asked nothing of her except honesty, she found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her answer was already forming itself clearly, without doubt, without fear, and without a single trace of the smallness the world had once demanded of her. Elinor did not give the Duke her answer that night on the cliff path, though not because she doubted her own feelings. She understood, with the same careful precision she brought to every important decision, that an answer given in the sweep of a single emotional moment was not the same as an answer she could trust to hold steady through every difficult season that would surely follow. She asked for time, and to his credit, the Duke granted it without protest or wounded pride, though the look in his eyes made clear how much the asking had cost him. She spent the following days walking the cliffs alone, turning the question over from every angle, testing it the way she tested any proposition, searching for its weaknesses. She thought of her family, of the sudden warmth that had appeared in her mother's letters only once the Duke's regard became known, warmth that told her plainly how conditional her family's love for her had always been. She thought of Lord Vane's cold contempt, and of how many more like him she would meet in a life spent beside a duke, each one another small test of whether her cleverness would be tolerated or resented in rooms far grander and far less forgiving than her aunt's cottage. But she thought, too, of the Duke's face when she had corrected his reasoning at that lamplit desk, unguarded and pleased rather than wounded. She thought of how he had defended her at his own table without hesitation, not because propriety demanded it, but because he genuinely believed she deserved it. She thought of the months they had spent working side by side, of arguments settled by evidence rather than pride, of a partnership built on something far sturdier than the fragile flattery she had once mistaken, in her younger years, for affection. She set for him a test, in the end, not out of doubt, but out of the same rigorous honesty she applied to every important matter. She asked him to stand publicly, before the full gathering of the county's most influential families at the upcoming autumn assembly, and acknowledge both her role in uncovering his estate's fraud and his intention to marry her, without softening the truth of her exile or pretending it had never happened. "If you cannot say it plainly there," she told him, "in front of the very people whose opinions matter most to your position, then I do not believe you can say it plainly anywhere, and I would rather know that now than discover it after we are already bound together." The Duke agreed without hesitation, though Elinor understood, watching his expression, that he recognized fully what such a public declaration would cost him. It was one thing to defend her quietly at his own table among old associates. It was quite another to stand before the assembled gentry of the county and declare, without apology, his intention to marry a woman that same gentry had already dismissed as unsuitable, too sharp, too strange, too clever for polite company. The autumn assembly arrived on a crisp evening in late October, the grand hall of the county's oldest estate filled with candlelight, and the low hum of conversation that fell into sudden, watchful silence the moment the Duke arrived with Elinor at his side. Elinor felt every eye in the room upon her, felt the old familiar urge to shrink beneath the weight of so much judgment, and forced herself instead to stand tall, remembering her father's note from all those months ago. "Do not let them make you smaller than you are." The Duke did not waste time with careful indirection. He addressed the assembled gathering directly, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, and told them plainly of the corruption his estate had suffered for 30 years, of the woman who had uncovered it through diligence no one else had thought to apply, and of his intention to marry her, not despite the reputation that had once seen her exiled from her own family's home, but because of the very qualities that reputation had unfairly condemned. "I am told," he said, his gaze finding Elinor's across the room, "that this county once decided Miss Ashworth's mind was too clever to be tolerated. I have found it, in every matter that has mattered to me these past months, indispensable. I do not apologize for choosing her, and I would ask that anyone who believes I should reconsider that choice bring me evidence rather than gossip, since Miss Ashworth herself has taught me to value one considerably more than the other." A ripple of murmurs swept the hall, some scandalized, some grudgingly impressed, and Alina watched as Lord Vane, standing near the back of the room, offered the smallest, most reluctant nod of acknowledgment she had yet seen from him. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was something, and Alina understood that it would have to be enough for now. What mattered more, standing there in the candlelight with every eye in the county upon her, was that the Duke had not softened a single word of the truth to make her more palatable to the room. He had not called her Exile a misunderstanding. He had not pretended her sharp mind was a quality he tolerated rather than one he genuinely valued. He had said it all plainly, without apology, exactly as she had asked, and in doing so, he had given her something far more valuable than any romantic gesture could have offered. Proof, beyond any reasonable doubt, that his regard for her was real. Alina gave him her answer that same night, standing beside him on the terrace outside the grand hall, while the assembly's murmured conversation drifted through the open doors behind them. "Yes," she said simply, without embellishment, because she had learned by now that plain truth served her better than elaborate speeches. "I will marry you, and I will not apologize for my mind on your behalf or on anyone else's, not now, not ever." The Duke's answering smile was the most unguarded expression she had yet seen from him, and when he took her hand, Alina felt, for the first time since that terrible morning the carriage arrived at her family's gate, that she was not being carried away from her life but finally, fully, arriving at it. The wedding took place the following spring, at Alina's own insistence, in a modest ceremony held not at the grand Callaway estate, but at the small coastal church nearest her aunt's cottage, surrounded by the tenants and fishermen and quiet, capable people who had first taught her, through their trust, that her mind was worth something after all. Margaret stood proudly at her side throughout the preparations, and even Alina's parents attended, her father with unreserved joy and her mother with a warmth Alina had decided, after long consideration, to accept without fully forgetting how recently it had been earned rather than freely given. Alina did not surrender the work she had built for herself. It was one of the clearest terms she set before the marriage, spoken plainly to the Duke during one of their long walks along the cliff path in the weeks before the ceremony, and one he had agreed to without hesitation, as though the idea of asking her to abandon it had never once occurred to him. "I will not become a duchess who exists only to be admired at dinners and forgotten in every matter that actually shapes this estate," she told him. "I have spent too many years being told my mind belonged locked away in some drawing room. I will not lock it away again, not for a title, not for anyone." "I would not want you to," the Duke said simply. "I did not fall in love with a woman willing to be quiet. I fell in love with the one who corrected my arithmetic within an hour of meeting me and has not stopped correcting me since." Alina laughed at that, a real, unguarded laugh, and found herself thinking that this, too, was a kind of proof, the easy warmth between them, the comfort of being fully known and fully welcomed rather than merely tolerated. In the years that followed, Alina's role at the Callaway estate grew steadily beyond anything either of them had first imagined. She oversaw the full restructuring of the estate's finances, corrected decades of quietly accumulated errors across every one of its holdings, and became, in time, a figure the county's other landholders quietly sought out for advice, however reluctantly some of them admitted needing it. Lord Vane, to Alina's private amusement, became one of her most frequent correspondents on matters of tenant law within only a few years, his early contempt worn away entirely by the simple, undeniable weight of her competence. Her own family's relationship with her settled into something imperfect, but genuine, built slowly across many visits and careful conversations. Her father's steady devotion never wavering, her mother's understanding deepening gradually as she watched her daughter build a life that had nothing to do with the narrow expectations she had once tried to force upon her. Alina's younger sisters, watching from a distance as their once exiled sister became one of the most respected women in the county, grew up believing something Alina herself had never once been permitted to believe as a girl. That a clever mind was not a flaw to be hidden but a strength to be claimed openly, without apology, by anyone bold enough to use it. Elinor thought often, in quiet moments on the cliff path she still walked most mornings, of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had arrived at her aunt's cottage all those years ago, certain her life had ended before it had truly begun. She thought of how wrong that fear had been, and how right her father's small note had turned out to be. She had not let them make her smaller. If anything, Exile had done the opposite, stripping away every pretense and expectation until only her truest self remained, sharp and capable and entirely her own, ready at last to be recognized rather than hidden. The world that had once called her too clever now called upon her constantly, for counsel, for judgment, for the clear thinking it had once found so threatening in a girl too young and too unguarded to hide it. Elinor never forgot the cost of that early rejection, the years of loneliness and doubt it had carved into her. But she came, in time, to understand it as Margaret once had, as the painful, necessary beginning of a life built entirely on her own terms rather than on the terms a frightened, narrow world had once tried to impose upon her. She had been exiled for being too clever. In the end, that same cleverness had built her an entire life, chosen freely, defended openly, and never, not once, requiring an apology from anyone, least of all herself.